I've got this impression that so far no one has really known what to do with all that extra disk space the Famicom Disk System offers. Even with Nintendo, the most they've done is have extra levels. Well, now Konami has reached the disk system, and they're going to show people how it's done. A little bit of context here. Konami had been making a ton of arcade games, and then starting around 1983, they really started shifting their focus more towards computer games. To the point where, in 1985, I'd really call them a computer game company. However, at the start of 1985, they began porting some of their computer games to the Famicom. These did extremely well, so at the start of 1986, Konami really started leaning into Nintendo's console as a target platform. So far in 1986, they've released Goonies and Ganbare Goemon as original games for the Famicom, plus ports of Twinbee and Gradius. But the disk system was an opportunity for them to leverage their knowledge of making computer games, and they would go big on the platform. They published 23 Famicom Disk System games, and the only company that published more was Nintendo themselves. And they really got things off with a bang with Akumajou Dracula. In September of 1986, this was the best looking console game ever released. Period. Hands down. No competition. Konami really leveraged the fact that they could completely unload the graphics and load in totally new ones with every stage. Famicom cartridges were limited by graphical memory. You only had so much, and you needed to reuse as much of it as possible. But here that limitation is gone, and so every stage is packed with gorgeous detail. The plot of Akumajou Dracula is that vampire hunter Simon Belmondo has decided to pick a fight with the biggest, baddest vampire around, Dracula himself. The title could be translated as Dracula's Demonic Castle, and that's the theme of the game, fighting your way through Dracula's castle from the gate to the highest tower. Belmondo's weapon of choice during this battle is the one weapon that any vampire hunter needs, a whip. Yes, he's gonna march into Dracula's chamber and give him a good lashing. As you play, A jumps, B attacks. Well, there's actually a lot to both of those actions. With the whip, it starts out as a rather puny thing, but it can be used to smash light sources and find power-ups. And when you have a weaker whip, whatever was normally in that light source could get replaced with a whip power-up. The first one doubles the whip's strength, the second one doubles its length. And in most circumstances, you'll pretty quickly rush through both of these power-ups. However, when you die, you go back to the default whip. And on later stages, there could be very few light sources to smash, and some nasty enemies between you and the power-ups. You really need that longer reach to be effective, especially in situations where you have to knock projectiles out of the air. Having 3 levels of whip has always felt like a strange design choice for me, since 95% of the time, it doesn't matter. You're not going to be doing a lot of fighting with a weak whip. But in those rare occasions where it does matter, it's more annoying than challenging. The whip also has a slight delay when you attack. There's a wind-up to the swing, so you have to attack a little bit earlier than you might think. It gives combat in Akumajou Dracula a little bit of a weird rhythm. Jumping in Akumajou Dracula also has its own weird rhythm. It feels closer to the early arcade games like Donkey Kong than it does to platformers of this time. Belmondo's jump is fixed. It always goes the same height, it always goes the same distance. Your options are either to jump straight up or jump forward. This is one of those things that gives people who have never played the game pause, but the levels are all designed around taking advantage of that consistent jump, so the platforming and jumping action really doesn't drag you down. Now the extreme knockback that comes from enemies, that's its own thing. That tends to be more of a threat than anything else in the game. Even if you're not getting knocked into holes when you get hit, you're often getting knocked into a position that's less advantageous for you. The enemies in Akumajou Dracula are some of the most iconic in video game history. If you play video games, then you know that red skeletons get back up, you know that axe knights throw boomerang-style shots, and I can trigger traumatic flashbacks in you by saying 2 words: Medusa heads. The bosses are classic movie monsters for the most part, though I don't really think death counts unless you really don't like Ingmar Bergman films. The enemy bar at the top of the screen is the boss's health, something that was vital to have visible the entire time you were playing. More seriously, it's probably because they didn't want to change the interface while people were fighting a boss, and they wanted to give players feedback on how they were doing. But it's still kind of amusing that it's there the whole time. Belmondo can collect additional weapons to assist him on his path. These drop from the light sources that you smash, and you use them by pressing up and B. Activating these weapons costs a heart, and those hearts also drop from candles, torches, and whatever else you whip that's on fire. Maybe some kind of sconce. You get way more hearts than you need, so it's always helpful to use your weapons rather than save them for the boss. Another reason that you'd want to use them is that using them on the regular enemies will eventually drop another weapon power-up. A double shot and then a triple shot. Initially you can only attack once with the weapon, and then have to wait for that attack to be done before you can launch again. But the double shot lets you do it twice, and the triple shot lets you do it 3 times. There are 5 special weapons in the game. The dagger is the most basic one. It flies straight ahead, and does absolutely pathetic damage. If you're relying on the dagger, then you might as well just use the whip. The stopwatch is the weapon that isn't a weapon. It just freezes all of the enemies in place. It also only affects the weakest of bosses, so you probably don't want to have it going into a fight. The stopwatch is also the most expensive weapon to use, costing 5 hearts to activate. The axe travels in a high arc, giving it a pretty useful niche. It's the only weapon that can hit things above you. It's never my first pick, but there's plenty of places where it's very useful. The cross acts as a boomerang, flying out and coming back. That makes it an extra effective weapon against bosses, where you're not going to take them out with 1 hit, so why not take 2? Or it would be a good choice if it wasn't for the fact that the final weapon, Holy Water, breaks the game. It goes in a downward arc, and when it strikes the ground it leaves a little flame behind. Anything that hits the flame is frozen in place. That includes bosses who will just get locked up right there. With a double or triple shot to ensure that the flame is continuous, it trivializes the hardest fights in the game. Besides the weapons, hearts, and weapon power-ups that drop from light sources, you can also find money bags that way, and those are worth points. Treasures are also hidden throughout the castle, and they appear when you perform some not always obvious actions. 50,000 points in Akumajou Dracula will earn you an extra life, so it's actually not bad to try to accumulate what you can. Though this is one of the Famicom Disk System games where you can save your progress. There are 3 save slots when you start up, and you can register your name. Though to save the game, you have to get a game over. There's one more thing you can find while exploring the castle, and that's everyone's favorite wall meat. Smashing open certain walls will reveal meat, hopefully well preserved, and that's how you restore Belmondo's health. If you're watching a video on Akumajou Dracula, then you already know it launched a huge franchise. There's a sequel on the Disk System that we'll see pretty quickly, and then another sequel on the Famicom. Akumajou Dracula was re-released on the Famicom at the very end of the system's life, and Konami added an easy mode for the cartridge version. Akumajou Dracula has been remade multiple times, and the very first reimagining was released just a month after this. Vampire Killer on the MSX is built on a lot of the same design, but takes the concept of exploring Dracula's castle in a completely different direction. While people often say that this series isn't as popular in Japan, at least for this original Akumajou Dracula, it was very popular. Not popular enough to be one of the top-selling Disk System games, but it was still beloved even at the time. My own take on Akumajou Dracula is, yeah, of course it's great. It's one of the all-time classic 8-bit games. One of the ones that defines the 8-bit look. It might be difficult, but it's still a delight to play. It's one of the ideal games of the era. It's really hard to get better than this.